all know about the Black Death. One of the most devastating plagues in history wiped out a big chunk of Europe's population in the 14th century. But what if this pandemic never occurred? What if the Black Death had zero impact on human history? Well, buckle up because we're about to find out. Welcome to my channel. And today, let's find out what would happen if the Black Death never hit. The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, was a horrible disease. It was first reported in 1346 and lasted for 5 years. It's considered one of the most devastating natural selection events in history. It wasn't very picky either. The Black Death didn't care about your status in life. It could kill everyone from kings to peasants. According to historical records, between 30 and 50% of Europe's population was wiped out by the plague. The Black Death had a huge impact on history. It changed how people lived, worked, and thought about the world. For example, it led to a lot of changes in Europe. First, it changed the way people worked. The plague killed so many people that there weren't enough workers for farms and businesses. This meant that the peasants who worked on farms had more power because they could demand higher wages and better conditions. They didn't have to work as hard for the nobles and kings anymore. This also helped end the feudal system, where peasants were tied to the land they worked on. Second, the Black Death changed how people thought about religion. Before the plague, most people in Europe were very religious. They believed that God was punishing them for their sins. However, when so many people died, even those who were good and followed the rules, people began to question the church and its teachings. They started thinking differently, and this new way of thinking led to the Renaissance, a time of great art, science, and culture. Finally, the Black Death changed how governments worked. In England, for example, the king raised taxes to try to pay for the care of the sick. This made people angry, and they rebelled against the king. The most famous revolt was led by Wat Tyler. He wanted to get rid of the taxes and have more rights. Although Tyler was killed, his revolt showed that people wanted more power, and this led to changes in government over time. But now let's think about what would have happened if the Black Death never happened. It's hard to say exactly what would have happened if the plague never struck, but historians have some ideas. They believe that if the plague hadn't happened, the feudal system would have continued for a longer time. This means that the peasants would have continued to work for the nobles and landowners and wouldn't have had the same rights as the middle class. Also, the Renaissance might not have happened. This was a time when people started to think and create in new ways. Many great artists and scientists lived during the Renaissance. If the plague hadn't happened, there might not have been enough people to carry on these new ideas. Finally, the Industrial Revolution might have come later. This was a time when machines started to take over people's jobs. Many people had to leave their farms and move to cities to find work in factories. If the plague hadn't happened, there may not have been enough people to start this big change. Let's imagine what the world would be like if the Black Death never happened. It's hard to imagine, but some experts believe that the world would be very different today. For example, if the Black Death had never happened, Europe might still be ruled by kings and queens. There would be no democracy or voting. Instead, the leaders would be in charge forever. The world would be very different if the Black Death didn't kill so many people. There might not be any supermarkets or cars. Also, life would be very hard for regular people. They would work long hours for low pay, and there would be no vacations or weekends. Imagine if the Black Death never happened and the world kept developing normally. Well, first of all, the population would be much bigger. There would be billions more people on the planet. All those extra people would need food, water, and homes, so the world would be busier and more crowded. Major cities would be gigantic. and there wouldn't be much open space. Plus, there'd be way more pollution, since so many more people would be living in close quarters. With so many people around, the world would have to find new ways to grow food. Farms would get bigger and more efficient to feed everyone. Maybe we'd have things like factory farms and artificial fertilizers. The way we farm now wouldn't exist yet. There'd also be more competition for resources. Countries would fight over oil, water, and other important stuff. Wars would be more common, and there'd be more fighting. If the Black Death didn't happen, the world might be wealthier. More people working would mean more money being made, but that wealth wouldn't be shared equally. Some people would become super rich, while others would live in extreme poverty. Huge gaps between rich and poor countries would form. If the plague hadn't happened, global inequality might be even worse today. Now let's go even further into the future. Imagine it's the year 2025 and the Black Death never occurred. You're re-watching TV at home and see news about Britain ruling most of Europe and the rest of the world. Think it's crazy? Well, it might not be too far from reality if the plague never hit. A world without the Black Death could look like this. By 2025, the Black Death wiped out lots of people in Europe and the UK. Having fewer people meant less farmland was needed. Since there wasn't a lot of development back then, the land wasn't used efficiently. After the plague, the UK had enough people to use its land well and keep growing its economy. It had more wealth, making it powerful. The other European countries got richer, too, but not as fast as the UK. This meant the UK could take land from weaker countries, which is why it would rule most of Europe in 2025. In this timeline, the Ottoman Empire would have expanded into Western Europe, controlling countries like France, Belgium, and Italy. They would have spread their culture, language, and religion. The rest of Europe would look different, too. Places like Russia and Germany might not exist. Instead, the Ottoman Empire might have controlled these areas. They would have influenced art, music, and literature in Europe, making it more diverse. But that's not all. Without the Black Death, Asia would also be different. China would still be one of the biggest economies, but it wouldn't be as poor. It would have grown faster and had more chances to invent new technologies. India and Japan would be the same, but maybe they'd be a bit wealthier. Overall, the world without the plague would be poorer, more unequal, and more crowded. Some people say the Black Death was a good thing, because it led to the Renaissance and gave people new ways of thinking. Others say it was terrible because it made people suffer and changed history. I guess it depends on how you see it. It makes you wonder what else could have happened if the course of history had taken a different path. Well, folks, we've reached the end of another thought-provoking episode. But don't worry, the adventure doesn't have to stop here. If you enjoyed this journey through time, I invite you to keep exploring the channel. We've got a ton of fascinating topics waiting to be uncovered. So click around, learn something new, and who knows, you might just expand your mind a little. Thanks for joining me on this adventure through history. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and above all, keep learning. Until next time, stay curious.